Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. Ooh, it's a very receptive microphone. Thank you all so much for coming out on this really beautiful evening indoors to do some learning together. We're really grateful for your time. My name is Priya. I'm the head of adult services here at Forbes Library. If you have any feedback or ideas or questions about our programming or services here at the library, come find me afterward and I can answer your questions. For those of you in the room this evening, the restrooms and the water fountain are across the art gallery and to the left in the arts and music department, and the main exits are through the gallery to the right, stairs or the elevator. We are also live streaming this event on our YouTube channel, and the recording will be available to view starting, I think, sometime tomorrow. So for those of you watching the live stream, hello. I don't believe we've gotten any backs of heads in view just now, but just be wary if you do stand up during the event. You may find the back of your head on our recording. That's okay. Just very briefly, Forbes Library programming is supported by the Friends of Forbes Library, which does fundraising for the library year-round. And one of their largest annual events, the annual garden tour, is coming up this Saturday. So if you have not gotten your tickets yet and you enjoy gardens in the Pioneer Valley, please do check it out. You can get tickets down at the lobby. It is going to be beautiful, and I hear the weather will cooperate. So hope to see some of you there. But let's jump into our event tonight. We are at the June reading for Readers and Writers Live, which is a series that we have brought back thanks to our lovely volunteer Mark Brumberg, who's in the audience, a series that existed some years ago and now we've brought back at Forbes. We're going to take a break for the summer after this event and kick it up in the fall again. And tonight's author is Alan Weisman. Briefly, with books like the best-selling The World Without Us, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Countdown, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, environmental journalist Alan Weisman established himself among the most prophetic voices on humanity's relationship to the earth. In his latest book, Hope Dies Last, 10 years in the making, he writes about what it means to be a human on the front lines of our planet's existential crisis. In researching this book, Weisman traveled the US and the globe, witnessing climate upheaval and other devastations, from the flooding Marshall Islands to revived wetlands in Iraq, from the Netherlands to Mexico, Bangladesh, and the Korean DMZ, to cities and coastlines in the Americas and beyond. He has encountered the best of humanity battling heat, hunger, rising tides, and imperiled wildlife. And that's just the first paragraph of his bio, so I'll let him finish up. And please note there are books available for sale just outside from Broadside Bookshop. With that, Ellen, come on up.
Thank you, Forbes Library. When I enter a library, this is my kind of cathedral, and I'm so grateful. And to Broadside Books, thank you so much. So, you wouldn't cover an apple with plastic wrap and then leave it in the sun, because pretty soon it would get warm and then soft, and it would develop those mushy brown spots and then rot. So why would anybody do that to their planet? Pretty much, we have shrink-wrapped ourselves in transparent layers of invisible CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, and every year temperatures are setting new records. Fixing this will not be as easy as ripping away plastic film, because gases are not that easy to grip. Plus, we are not the only species feeling the heat. So do those that pollinate our food, break down our waste, enrich our soil, and fill our plates. But with climate cues gone all askew and natural habitats subsumed by sprawl and croplands, scientists fear that we will lose species faster than they can count. So in 2019, I began investigating our realistic hopes for reining in climate change before it waxes out of control, or at least enough to give us time to adapt. And for staunching the loss of our brethren species, and for somehow raising enough food for 2 billion humans more who are expected by the year 2050 without damaging the planet further? Little existential questions like that. After a dozen countries, one global pandemic, a brief stint in jail, I was reporting on protesters chained to tar sands oil pipeline being rammed through Ojibwe country in Minnesota when this overzealous sheriff nabbed me. Anyhow, after all that, unexpectedly, I found myself thinking, yeah, maybe we can. Because everywhere I researched Hope Dies Last, I met inspiring, ingenious, stubborn visionaries, engineers, scientists, agronomists, architects, indigenous elders, Gen Z futurists, even the military. Imaginative people who refuse to quit trying to find us a viable future, regardless of the odds, and sometimes pulling off some real surprises. So, I know you've seen the book. If it looks thick, it's because more than an inch of that is acknowledgments to them, plus the bibliography, which is in very small type, but is a guarantee, said the Associated Press reviewer, that this isn't fake news, but deeply documented and corroborated. I started the book in one of the most symbolic places on earth, in southern Iraq, at the top of what its neighbor Iran calls the Persian Gulf, but neighbor Kuwait calls the Arabian Gulf. Does this sound familiar? But this is the Mesopotamian cradle of civilization. Many archaeologists and ecologists believe that it's also a relic of the legendary Garden of Eden, which the Bible describes as where four great rivers meet, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and one which corresponds to today's Saudi, Kuwaiti Wadi al-Batin, and the Karun River, which pours down from Iran's Zagros Mountains. Descriptions of Eden in the Judeo-Christian Bible and in similar Sumerian and Akkadian stories that predate it don't correspond much with the creation of a universe 13.6 billion years ago, but they do resemble the end of the Pleistocene, which is when seas were 300 feet lower than today because so much of the Earth's moisture was locked up in glacial ice. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the exposed top of that gulf, which is this lush quadruple river delta, would have been a natural paradise, like the first chapter of Genesis describes. But after our forebears noticed that a handful of seeds would germinate wherever they spilled them, and also realized that they could capture and breed game in corrals made of vines and tree trunks to eat at their leisure rather than having to hunt all day, well, then Genesis 2 retells the Bible's creation story because suddenly we're no longer gatherers, but tillers of a garden. Not for long. Archaeologists calculate that as retreating Ice Age glaciers melted, the Persian-Arabian Gulf rose so fast that each generation had to retreat several kilometers to stay dry. So this place is also where the earliest versions of the flood and ark story appear in Sumerian cuneiforms. Well, today the seas are rising again. They're pushing salt water up the Tigris and Euphrates. Summer temperatures in southern Iraq hovered near 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is well beyond the capacity for human sweat to wick away. So when the cradle of civilization and of three great world religions becomes unlivable, I think that's telling us something. But I also went there to meet Azam Alwash, who, defying experts, saved the biggest wetland in the Middle East. During the 1990s, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had drained the vast Tigris-Euphrates marshes, that relic Eden ecosystem, to flush out Shiite rebels. And by the time Hussein was deposed a decade later, in 2003, biologists declared it too desiccated, impossible to revive. Azam, who grew up fishing the marshes, was a civil engineer, not an ecologist, but his career had taught him that nature is resilient and that the word impossible often masks a lack of imagination. How do we know unless we try, he asked. This is a refrain that I heard from stubborn visionaries I met worldwide, challenging conventional wisdom. Well, after fruitlessly begging for international assistance, including from the United States, which had further desecrated this hallowed cradle with its disastrous invasions, finally, Azam's engineer colleague, Jassim al-Assadi, found an excavator, which they rented for $30, and they punched through Hussein's main diversion dike themselves. And for a month, the water from the Euphrates mixed with parched soil, and it was like this stinking mess. But then cattail shoots appeared, and then papyrus and phragmites, thick as bamboo, and soon the rehydrated marshes were bright green. The arrival of kingfishers and herons, egrets, pygmy cormorants meant that the fish were back. Spoonbills, ibis, godwits, marble teals, 2 species of eagles, again spread through the reconstituted marshes. The endemic Basra reed warbler was heard again. Badgers, boar, otters, all these returning mammals, plants, fish, Euphrates soft-shelled turtles, all these have restored a functioning ecosystem and a mecca for migratory birds, and welcomed home thousands of the Madan. They are the indigenous marsh dwellers who've raised water buffalo there since Sumerian times. In 2013, Azam and Jassim were awarded the Goldman Prize, called the Environmental Nobel. But nothing simple. Just last year, Jassim, who directs the NGO they founded, Nature Iraq, was kidnapped by people demanding he stop his environmental work in this World Heritage Site, beneath which lies oil. He refused, so for 2 weeks they tortured him daily, beatings, electroshocks, holding his face underwater. After some tribal negotiations, they finally let him go, and he went right back to the marshes. He's there today. I just heard from him. You'll meet other brave people in this book who put their lives on the line for our future, such as Ojibwe women, their tribe's water protectors who literally lay in front of bulldozers. I also go to some places where the battle to keep this planet livable is being waged that you might not expect, such as MIT's Plasma Physics Science Center, whose director, Dennis White, reminded me that to replace fossil fuels means replacing 82% of the world's energy. But White had a dream. Look, I'm as dubious as you are that technology can save us from the messes that technology has created. But given our huge lopsided presence on this planet, I figure we're going to need help. Frankly, at this point, I think we need to try everything. So what MIT is trying truly is a technocrat's dream, trapping starlight on Earth to tap its essentially inexhaustible power derived from nuclear fusion, which is both carbon and radiation free. Now, fusion, you may know, has long been called perpetually 20 years down the road because getting hydrogen atoms to collide and fuse on Earth has always taken more energy than it produced. But some half-dozen companies worldwide are now racing each other and the climate crisis. The leader, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, spun off from one of White's plasma physics classes of what he calls the world's most brilliant 23-year-olds, who I describe achieving a thrilling technological breakthrough in, of all places, the original Nabisco Oreo factory. Now, having raised $2 billion in venture capital, they are immune to capricious federal funding. They're now building a prototype fusion plant just outside of Boston. Actually, it's just off Route 2 near Leominster. It's designed to fit a coal-fired plant's footprint so it can connect to existing transmission lines and be mass-producible and assembled and easily serviced by any conventional contractor and be cost-competitive, especially because there's essentially nothing to mine. Because if it works, a quart of recyclable seawater could power your life for a year pollution-free. Here's some even wilder technology. A legendary plant breeder named Molly John, think delicata squash, among others, she became convinced that agriculture has to stop plowing up habitats and being addicted to chemicals. Because not only are we using nearly half the unfrozen earth just to feed one species, us, but farming fueled by synthetic fertilizer is ultimately responsible for a third of all greenhouse gases. So, stepping down as dean of the University of Wisconsin's Ag School, Molly convinced DARPA, that's the Defense Department's Advanced Research Project Agency, to fund her scheme for a portable system to make food from thin air. It would feed airborne nitrogen, hydrogen, and excess CO2 to fast-growing fermented microbes, adding texture and flavor to make nutritious and tasty meals anywhere. I mean, say for a platoon of soldiers bivouac far from supply lines, or to feed a group of starving refugees in a war zone. So one of the many ironies I discovered while researching this book is that the Defense Department may be the most forward-looking U.S. Governmental agency, because DARPA is charged with seeking solutions to security problems that haven't even manifested yet, and then to take wild risks, to dream up inventions to dream up inventions that might truly change the game, if only they existed, and then to try to build them. Its ARPANET became the internet, which its GUI lets us use by pointing at pictures. DARPA also gave us GPS, the computer mouse, weather satellites, Siri, drones, and the use of mRNA to repel viruses, which led to the COVID vaccine. Other DARPA ideas have proved less successful, such as plant-powered robots that could recharge by foraging, or self-repairing living construction materials, or mechanical beasts of burden to lighten soldiers' loads. But DARPA's willingness to fail big en route to bold breakthroughs was ideal for Molly John, because someday, she predicts, everybody's kitchen can be a farm. Not agriculture, she says, ubiquiculture. And I have another chapter that follows a company that's hoping to completely replace artificial fertilizer by coating corn and wheat kernels with nitrogen-fixing microbes, and then that will then colonize their roots like the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that legumes like soy naturally host. And then there's another in which seaweed farmers are growing both food for us and feedstock for plastic that, when it inevitably ends up in the ocean, it'll simply dissolve back into the stuff of seaweed. But I also investigated a bigger technology that much of the world is already desperately counting on. From New Orleans after Katrina, New York after Superstorm Sandy, from sinking Jakarta to the drowning Marshall Islands, literally dozens more. In the 21st century, the world is turning to the Dutch to learn how they've managed not to drown over the past 1,000 years. So for 10 days, I toured the Netherlands, looking at their ingenious defenses that hold back the sea and accommodate Europe's major rivers that drain there. Collectively known as Delta Works, they're among human history's most ambitious civil engineering feats. And yet Dutch engineers admitted to me that if sea rise keeps accelerating and storms pound harder and harder, by 2050 they may have to rethink their own vaunted technology or retreat to higher ground. More than half the Dutch live at or below sea level, so that would be quite a migration. I then joined a Dutch consultant in Bangladesh, which hopes to emulate the Netherlands since both countries are two-thirds river delta. Only Bangladesh is 4 times bigger, with rivers like the Ganges and the Brahmaputra that dwarf the Rhine, and they pound down from these melting Himalayan glaciers to the fast-warming Bay of Bengal. Now, to afford multi-billion-dollar Dutch climate protections, Bangladesh was trying to leap quickly to the upper middle class by, you may find this counterproductive, by building the world's second biggest coal-fired plant. Moreover, to import coal cheaply from nearby India, they built it just upstream from the Sundarbans, which is the world's biggest mangrove forest and biggest Bengal tiger preserve, where I spent 3 days. I know, this is maddening. I took a boat right up to its enormous smokestack. And frankly, the Dutch aren't much better. I mean, Rotterdam is Europe's oil port. That's how they can afford their technology. But here's a Dutch story you're going to like better. In 2013, Marianne Manesma pulled off what everybody thought was impossible. She still hears that. I thought it was possible, she says. Marianne, who has 3 bachelor's and 3 master's degrees, had directed green energy programs and a Greenpeace climate change campaign in Eastern Europe when she was invited to lead a Rotterdam University Sustainability Institute. Its doctoral students, she realized, produce books that at most 10 people are going to read. So what are we really changing, she asked her co-director. So they brainstormed an action plan for every year up to 2050, spotlighting projects showing that sustainability is more than just new light bulbs and home insulation or switching to plant protein. What they called their urgent agenda for 2050 ended up on the front page of the leading Dutch newspaper, generating thousands of emails, and thus was born their NGO, Urgenda. So in 2010, she started wondering, why aren't there more solar panels? What's everybody waiting for? Well, the simple answer was that despite some government subsidies to help homes become energy neutral, only the wealthy or businesses could afford an 80 to 100,000 euro outlay for solar. That much isn't necessary, she argued, and government experts disagreed. So she emailed the Urgenda membership saying that if they bought their panels jointly, they could bring the price down themselves. Who'd be willing, she asked, to finance 35,000 euros, which is what they generally spent on energy for 15 years, if they knew they'd never have another energy bill? You could pay it back over 15 years for what you now spend on energy per month, she said. It's a solution with no additional cost. So when the banks wouldn't loan her money, enough members were willing to advance a portion that she flew to China herself and bought 50,000 cheap solar panels, plus the connecting hardware. Today, Urgenda makes houses energy neutral for 35,000 euros. We give them around 20 solar panels per house, heat pumps, an induction stove, and electric water heater. Today, 20 million of the Netherlands' 7 million houses are solarized. But then in 2013, Urgenda made environmental history, not just for the Netherlands, but for the whole world. Manesma had read a book by a Dutch attorney, Roger Cox, who argued that if governments fail to safeguard citizens and future generations against catastrophic climate change, the only remaining democratic course was to sue them. The Dutch government was a signatory to statements like the UN's Convention on Climate Change, that industrial countries should reduce greenhouse gases by 25 to 40% by 2020, but it had done remotely nothing to meet that goal. So Urgenda hired Roger Cox and they sued, amassing 886 co-plaintiffs who accompanied them to deliver the summons in person, the youngest 5 years old. They sued their government on the grounds that failure to address climate change was endangering its citizens' lives. That case was held in The Hague in 2015. The Netherlands argued that it was too small to impact the climate. Cox replied that the Dutch government had repeatedly signed those accords, stating the contrary for industrialized nations regardless of size. And the judges agreed. The government was obliged to reduce national emissions by at least 25% by 2020. The Netherlands appealed on 29 grounds, and assuming it would be overturned, did nothing. The appeals court rejected all 29. The Netherlands appealed again to its own Supreme Court, which in 2019 upheld both the lower court's rulings. It was unprecedented anywhere. A climate case successfully adjudicated against a government under its own laws. But winning would be meaningless if the government couldn't comply, so Urgenda was ready with a list of 54 actions that together would mitigate 17 megatons of CO2 to fulfill the court order. Those measures range from more rooftop solar to reducing speed limits, compulsory LED in greenhouses, extinguishing office and Did I touch it?
Oh, I think the battery's just running low.
Oh,
Let me try to get some replacements.
you got another one right there? Well, I don't want to leave you hanging. We still have some battery here. So in 2022, Maria Manesma was also awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize.
We good?
Yeah. Okay, so then, using their same language and same lawyer, in 2018, Friends of the Earth Netherlands filed the same suit in the same court in The Hague against the country's biggest, most valuable company, Royal Dutch Shell. Climate policy is focused on nations, said its director. That excludes the biggest polluters, who are multinationals, who are not regulated. The biggest 25 literally produce half. That's 25 CEOs who can fit into a city bus. They are responsible for half of all global emissions. And again, they won. And they expected to win an appeal in the same courts where Urgenda triumphed, but Shell did not wait to find out. After 131 years, it dropped Royal Dutch from its name and moved its headquarters to London. So like I said, nothing is simple. I have another courtroom story in the book that's set in the American Southwest. It involves 3 contract biologists who sued their employer, the U.S. Forest Service, basically for trying to inflate the count of Mexican spotted owls in New Mexico to prove that they weren't endangered so they could sell clear-cutting licenses. The biologists who sued, of course, were fired, but to their surprise, their suit proved uncontestable and they won. So next, they tried suing the Defense Department for violating the Endangered Species Act because a White Sands missile range commander had once acknowledged that wolves could be successfully reintroduced there, but did nothing. And they won that too, and kept winning. Today, the Tucson-based Center for Biological Diversity that they founded, it drives many people crazy. They employ teams of ecologists, strategists, and lawyers that wield one of the world's most powerful environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act, like a bludgeon. They've now sued more than 900 times on behalf of animals and plant life, from polar bears to orchids to slugs, and they've won 83% of their cases. Once a U.S. Forest Service lawyer got so frustrated in court, he actually leapt for their attorney's throat. They've compelled ranchers to stop grazing along stream beds because they're homes to goshawks and southwestern willow flycatchers. So for the first time, courts declared that wild creatures might be more valuable than cows. Now, for this chapter, I went into Mexico's Sierra Madre and Arizona's Sky Island Mountains as the center plotted to help jaguars, who once lived as far north as the Grand Canyon, reestablish themselves in the Southwest, again using the Endangered Species Act. President Richard Nixon signed that act, but now President Trump threatens to defang it, along with protections for forests and waters and the climate. Besides his border wall, which jaguars are still finding their way around, he's now trying to redefine protection of endangered plants or animals as not including protection for their habitats from overexploitation. Now, to assert that any species could be safe if its home isn't would be like taking the White House, Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago away from him to see how long he'll survive roofless and without air conditioning or food. Speaking of food, there's a rather delicious story in here of how the Comcac, that's Mexico's Sonora coastal Seri Indians, they meet a 3 Michelin star Spanish chef. Chef Angel Leon grew up in El Puerto de Santa Maria on Cadiz Bay, that's where Columbus sailed from, and his restaurant there, Poniente, was named the Earth's most sustainable by World's Best 50 Restaurants for wasting no part of every fish, finding something savory to do with everything in the net, from eating lower on the food chain, the marine food chain, than anyone had ever imagined. Chef Angel marinates discarded fish parts in sauces made from mackerel eyes and seaworms and jellyfish, or just fish bones. He makes savory wafers from sardine scales. He has recipes for plankton that he grows himself. He's perfected algae spaghetti, marshweed, honey, crisp moray, eel skin, melanges of sea vegetables, bioluminescent soup, and sea charcuterie, which are blood sausages, mortadella, bacon, pig skins, and hams, all confected from the unwanted parts of fish, mussels, sea bass, squid, whatever the fishermen bring him. Alongside his food laboratory, he houses a nonprofit research institute dedicated to restoring the Bahia de Cádiz. He's now trying to see if local eelgrass grain, which the Seri once harvested traditionally in Mexico's Sea of Cortez, to see if that can be domesticated to give humanity another grain crop that can grow in shallow seawater. Now, the Seris foraged it wild. They never aimed for mass production. But Angel Leon is convinced that even if it proves impossible, it'll be an instructive failure. With the land overexploited, he says, the sea is the future of food. We're opening windows into that future. I should admit here, full disclosure, that for that chapter, which is set in both in the Sea of Cortez and in Spain, I was, for research purposes, forced to eat a 3-star Michelin meal, but it was tax deductible. It's, journalism, it's tough work. In 3 countries, I show 3 different approaches to keeping cities viable. One I'll mention was dreamed up by a Zimbabwean woman and a French-Polynesian man, and it's now under construction in Busan, South Korea. It's the port city that ships us all our Samsungs and Hyundais. It's the first floating coastal city. It's designed to rise with the seas rather than be swamped by them. It will at first be mixed income housing for 12,000 people plus commercial spaces and totally solarized, but it's modular and it could grow to house hundreds of thousands. With 2/3 of the world's population now living within 200 meters of kilometers of a coastline, and nearly every world financial capital a coastal city. I mean, think Shanghai, New York, Sydney, Buenos Aires, Mumbai. It's a long list. I mean, something like that is just going to have to happen. Now, the Ojibwe women who I met in northern Minnesota were unable to stop Enbridge Line 3, that pipeline carrying Athabascan tar sands crude, which is one of the filthiest of all fossil fuels, right through their wild rice harvesting grounds and under 200 lakes and rivers, including the Mississippi. But they keep resisting and persisting, as they have for hundreds of years. One elder, Winona LeDuc, has opened a solar furnace factory that provides good jobs, and she's starting commercial hemp farming as an alternative to working in the corporate McDonald's French fry potato plantations that surround her White Earth reservation. At one point in the book, Winona says, "The only path to hope is to hope big." And I love that quote because it epitomizes visionary thinking, seeing the big picture and then daring to take big risks, to take on big power, or even daring to fail big, especially when honor is at stake, and then strategizing what to try next. That same conviction inspires Jalton Anjane, whose father was called the Moses of the Marshall Islands for rescuing his people from an atoll that the U.S. had irradiated during hydrogen bomb tests. Jalton now educates their descendants in a sustainability lab funded by the Roddenberry Foundation, that's the Star Trek people, and the U.S. Navy, that will make both the Marshalls a more livable place as long as you're still above water, but also prepare the next generation to go into the diaspora with good employable skills, should they ever have to abandon their home islands. Sad, yeah, but not hopeless. There may be much to grieve upcoming, but we can never let grief defeat us. In fact, I found one of this book's most hopeful stories in one of Earth's poorest places, a Rohingya refugee camp. It's a solar and battery-powered Wi-Fi network that lets people living in these stifling one-room huts trade and share energy with their neighbors to power fans and light bulbs and charge their mobile phones. Each cluster of huts is connected to surrounding clusters and so on, all without power lines. This peer-to-peer networks creator, which is a Dhaka, Bangladesh-based company, SoulShare, is now outfitting and connecting Bangladesh's 3 million plus electric rickshaws with solar rechargeable batteries, whose remaining juice each night will help feed the national grid. It's clean, it's technically easy, it saves everybody money, and it makes so much sense. At one point, I follow an unlikely collection of self-described nerds, Gen Zers, and queers called Climate Defiance, who scream truth right into the face of power, hounding politicians who take oil money by leaping onto stages where they're speaking to accuse them of frying their future. I saw them do that to the CEO of Bank of America, one of the world's biggest fossil fuel financiers. And they harassed a deputy interior secretary, the one who approved the Willow Project in Alaska, so much that he quit. They were key to getting President Biden to pause the liquid natural gas plant buildup on the Gulf Coast, which President Trump, unfortunately, has resumed. But climate defiance hasn't stopped under Trump. They're now getting thrown in jail, but they keep coming. 11 new chapters formed right after the election. Look, I know, so far, Congress and the courts have let Trump break laws with impunity. And some people are fine with that. But he can't break the laws of physics. We've had to invent a whole new vocabulary: megafires, gigafires, bomb cyclones, atmospheric rivers, all showing what overheating the atmosphere does. Presidents can hide in bunkers, but most voters can't. And next time, I'm betting they're going to know what to do. Look, my book, Hope Dies Last, doesn't pull any punches about the quandary that humanity and all other species currently face. While working on this, I tell people that I didn't set out to write a book about solutions, but rather an exploration of what hope still means as we stand on an existential brink. But by the end, it turns out I did. We're the solutions. Hope just isn't wishing for something to happen. Hope is an action verb, not a passive state. And courage isn't fearlessness, it's setting fear aside to do what's needed. Everyone I portray in this book is scared of how things could end up unless somebody acts. So they do. They don't wait for miracles, they keep trying to make them. The surest way to fail, I heard repeatedly, is not to try. So we must. We can open up to questions, but I just wanted to share with you that while researching this, I made two of what you might arguably call spiritual pilgrimages. One was in Najaf, Iraq, to the tomb of Imam Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law, who the Shiite Muslims believe the Prophet named as his heir. Sunnis believe that the spiritual lineage goes through another one of Muhammad's relatives, father-in-law. Look, I'm not a Muslim or anything else, but I went there because Shiites also believe that Ali is buried alongside Adam and Noah. In fact, he was assassinated while praying at the nearby house where Noah allegedly built his ark. Groups like the Center for Biological Diversity are essentially trying to do the same thing. Lifeboat enough species into the future to make sure this Earth remains viable. And hopefully with us, which is what this book is all about. My other pilgrimage was during my trip along the Mesoamerican Reef, which is the world's second longest after Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It runs from along the Yucatan Peninsula, then down past Belize and Guatemala, and then across northern Honduras. I was there with scientists from Stanford and the World Wildlife Fund and NASA climate modelers who were briefing local coastal conservationists and refuge managers on what they're going to be facing upcoming as the seas rise and plotting how to respond. For example, instead of building rigid breakwaters that end up failing, they can encourage mangroves and oyster beds, seagrass, salt marshes, and sand dunes, which are all natural storm barriers that can move with changing coastlines to soften the impact on human coastal communities. While in the Yucatan, I paused in the seaside hamlet of Chicxulub. That's where 66 million years ago, an asteroid finished off 75% of all species, including big reptiles that ruled here for 160 million years. Except, that is, for some tiny feathered dinosaurs who are still flying in our midst and singing to us every morning. And there was also a small shrew-like mammal who managed to survive in burrows named Purgatorius. That's our ancestor, yours and mine. A few weeks later, I was with those same modelers again at NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies in New York. And there I met the eloquent climate research physicist Kate Marvel, who was studying the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM, which was a large-scale release of carbon dioxide about 55 million years ago. That's the best historical analog for what we're facing today. She says, what's fascinating about the PETM, she said, is that despite really pronounced warming, there's no geological record of a mass extinction. Now, since this was just 10 million years after the dinosaurs died, possibly the species that survived could basically survive anything. But Kate Marvel is convinced that survival is still our option if we choose it. Because whenever she hears someone say, it'll take a miracle to escape this existential mess we've created, she has a ready reply. I believe in miracles. I live on one. So do we. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or bullets or whatever you have. So.
And if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you with the teeny tiny microphone in the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. What caused the the huge carbon dioxide surge?
It was caused by plate tectonics, which used to be the way that carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere. I mean, the biggest explosion of it was the Permian extinction in what today is Siberia. It came up right through the Carboniferous layer, this huge volcanic explosion. And the molten lava kept coming for about 1 million years, so this was a lot of global warming. The PETM was something similar. It just, there was just a lot of, I don't know that they know exactly where. I think there's some suspicion where, but there was a big burping of CO2. But I must say, it happened over 15,000 years. We have done, I mean, think of it. I mean, as I mentioned, I started this book in this really symbolically potent place, where civilization and Judaism and Christianity and Islam began. The first civilization grew up there, the Sumerians. And it's amazing when you go there and you see the Medan, they are still living the way that the Sumerians did in these big, huge arched houses made of bundled reeds. It's a fabulous sight. But that was 8,000 years ago when agriculture was invented. And at one point in the book, you go to Uruk, which was the Sumerian capital. It was a city that existed for 5,000 years. And then the Euphrates brought down so much silt that it changed its course, and suddenly Uruk was left high and dry. This is what happens when you're left high and dry. But my point here is civilization has been going on for about 8,000 years. The gas, oil, and coal industries, as we know them, have been going on for about 150 years. That's a lot of damage really fast, 100 times faster than the PETM. But anything that's only 150 years old, I mean, come on, that can be stopped, really. And there are ways to do it. And you'll meet people in this book who have ideas of how to do that. More questions?
Hi, Alan.
Hi, Abby.
We know each other. I've been reading the book, and it's amazing. And I'm also like, I think it's helpful to have so much of this framed around hope and possibility, because it's so easy to get like despairing, and then from there feel like action isn't worth it, or like isn't going to get you anywhere. So I was just curious if there's, having worked on this book for 10 years, if there's any particular thing that, when you're feeling like flood of despair or like concern, that like helps you kind of hold on to the hope.
Having to deal with existential crises every day, which I had to do, and I'll exclude the research, because even when I'm looking at a disaster out there, it's amazing to be on the road and meeting people and feeling their environment, and I don't even think sometimes about the implications while I'm there. But while I'm sitting, as I did for 18 months, in front of my screen waiting for words to materialize finally, that was hard. And it was depressing because I knew what the stakes were. But then I started telling these people's stories again. And the best I can tell you is that by the end of doing this book, I was more uplifted by them than I was depressed by what we are dealing with. I mean, this ain't over. This really ain't over. This human adventure is still ongoing, and there are plenty of opportunities to do miraculous things. The people who have read the book, who have talked to me about the experience of it, is that it was like chapter after chapter, they go, wow, And some of these people, are these born leaders, and some of them are just normal people who rise to the occasion. We can all rise to the occasion. There are ways in all of our lives we can. We can scream truth to power. I don't know if anybody here is busy on Saturday, but I think there's going to be a national scream that is going to be emitted, and I would encourage you to attend. There's many sites, including here in Northampton. Yeah.
Scale, issues of scale. It strikes me that's part of what's going on here, is that there is the desire to think big and have massive scale, take big risks. But then these little things, like the seagrass, the eelgrass. And I was just listening to a guy, Ivan Manovic or something, the Serbian guy who helped overturn Milosevic with climate defiance. They had him on, and he was talking about these actions that they, just for example, they would put a drum, a barrel in the street and put a sign saying, if you want to get rid of Milosevic, retire him, put money in here, and another sign that said, and if you don't have the money, bang the drum, bang the barrel. Like this little tiny action that just lit up the neighborhood, and everybody had a way to do it, something. And the police were forced to, they could either leave it or they could arrest the barrel. They looked ridiculous. So there's that level of it just really struck me as how, we're preparing for a national protest on Saturday. And then there's this other level that strikes me as equally powerful in its own way. And so issues of scale seem like a really key thing.
It can start with any individual. You know, I think Margaret Mead had a very famous saying about that, and she said it usually does. You know, it just takes a handful of people to make a difference. I mean, climate defiance was a fascinating part of my research. Started around Washington, D.C. about, I mean, you know, they joke about this themselves. They're sort of, you know, the kids who got bullied and kicked around and stuff like that. And, you know, and a lot of them are queer. And, you know, they were kind of really smart misfits who were really pissed off that they didn't have a future, you know, and unless something changes fast, because they did well in their science classes and they know what's going to happen. So they realized, I mean, there's an interesting connection in a couple of chapters in this book, and I'm not going to spoil the story for you right now, but one involves a huge demonstration, which was really massive, and then after that, everybody went home. What they decided, because they were there, was that, and actually it was just one of them, the guy who founded it, a kid named Michael Greenberg. And he said, you know, maybe what we need are just small actions by small people, you know, just a few people. Coincidentally, Mariam Minesma Urgenda, she keeps it at 15 people. She doesn't, you know, she wants to keep them lean, that everybody knows who's talking. You know, you can just get lost in a bureaucracy. And climate defiance just forms these little groups that they're very stealthy. They work their way into wherever somebody's speaking, like an Amy Klobuchar book talk where, you know, the joy of politics. And they jump on the stage and they say, I'm glad you're happy, Amy, but you're happy because do you know how much money you took from fossil fuel interests last year? You know, there's a certain congressman who I might say the same thing about that some of you know. You know, getting in their faces, screaming until you run them off the stage. When it happens after about 3 times, either they get really vicious or they start to talk to you. And that's what happened during the Biden administration with climate defiance. Finally, Leo Panetta gave up. He said, you guys are such a pain in the ass. And they said, thank you. And then he invited them to sit down and talk. And that's how that natural gas thing happened. It's just a few, you know, like 15 kids did this. Now, the Trump administration, yeah, we're up against a juggernaut there. But, you know, it's true that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And there are going to be some cracks in that gilded facade. And people are going to figure out how to penetrate them. And those cracks are going to get wider. And, you know, the pressure just has to be maintained. And I don't know, you know, what's this going to lead to? We'll find out. I mean, we're witnessing an autocratic takeover of a government right now in the United States, something that Benjamin Franklin warned us against. We don't have to let them do that. But if we don't do anything, they will. So, you know, there's no way around that. I mean, look, I got arrested for, you know, by a fossil fuel company that had basically deputized all of law enforcement in Minnesota to guard its pipeline. And they had set up this $8 million escrow fund for the added cost of protecting critical public infrastructure. But all that critical public infrastructure was on land that Enbridge had bought because, not because they had to, because it could be condemned, you know, for being critical public infrastructure. But by buying the land, then that critical public infrastructure is on private land, and they can put up no trespassing signs, which is how I got arrested, along with all these people who had chained themselves to pumping mechanisms. This could end up being a real battle. And we all grew up in this post-war bubble, peacetime bubble, that was really a wonderful time to be alive. And we grew up in a country with a lot of privileges. Our right to those privileges is being challenged right now. And every one of us is going to have to figure out how. My part in this, has been writing a book that I hope gives some people ideas and certainly gives people inspiration, because chapter after chapter in a completely different situation, you're going to meet somebody who just figured out a way to meet the moment, and that's really exciting. I would like to add, by the way, that since the person who asked me that question I happen to know is a wonderful artist, that you will meet artists in this book too. There are three who are really inspirational people, because we can no sooner have a world without trees than we can have a world without the arts. We need the arts to inspire us and to fill our souls. And you'll meet a couple of artists who have gone into some of the most difficult places on earth, determined to make art. And they end up inspiring everybody, and end up also in all three cases, being inspired to provide art that didn't just express what is going on in the environment, but actively work to change it. They're really beautiful stories. I'll let you read all about them. I'm sorry, were there any more questions? Well, one question that I've been hearing in these talks that I've been giving, I'll just mention, is, how do you raise kids in the environment that they are in right now with all this uncertainty in the world? And my response is two things. First of all, take children into nature. You may have a tug of war with that glowing screen, but you can eventually get them to go for an hour or something like that. And challenge them just to find one interesting thing. And of course, they'll be solid and eye-rolling for the first 20 minutes, and then something will catch their eye. And they may even ask you about it. And what'll really be fortunate is if you don't know the answer, because the next time you go, they will tell you. They will have researched it. And they will have realized that nature is this fascinating place. But I also want you to take them to museums and to concerts, to art galleries, because it's really important that kids do not grow up hating the human race for the mess that we have made. Our cultural expressions, our music, our art, our literature, our poetry, our theater, this is the stuff that shows off better than anything that I know the beauty of who we are. And you want kids to have that, as well as understanding the beauty of nature. I'll be out here signing books for anybody who wants them. Thanks for coming.